This program is about mysteries. When possible, attempts have been made to bring additional information to the discussion of the mystery being presented. What you are about to see is presented solely for entertainment purposes and is not a news broadcast.
I want to welcome you to the Retro Rogues Live Mysteries. My name is Dave Beaty, and I am one of your hosts. For nearly the last 30 years, I've been a professional illustrator and a graphic designer. You may ask yourself, what does this have to do with mysteries? What does this have to do with investigation? My answer to you is absolutely nothing, but hopefully this show is entertaining and fun, and that's what this is all about. Now, you may ask yourself, what do fun and murder have to do with each other? Nothing. But enough about that. I want to welcome my co-host. This is Mr. Eric Alexander. Please tell the folks who'll be watching or listening at home a little bit about your background.
So in discussing that, I want to emphasize that I do go by Bass God 14. That's not Bass God 14. That is Bass God 14. That's actually like a bass guitar, if you can think of it that way. And right now, I actually am an independent film producer. And I'm actually the CFO of a small independent film company called Bad Bob Productions. But back in a prior life, just a few years ago, I was actually a police officer for 20 years. So that's kind of something that I'm going to be bringing to the table a little bit in this. I'm not going to put I'm trying not to put my cop hat on too much, when we're doing this, but definitely it's something else that I bring to the table when we're talking about these mysteries.
So on this particular episode of the Retro Rogues Live Mysteries, we're actually talking about an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. This is Volume 2 that's currently available on Netflix. We're talking about Episode 5, Lady in the Lake. So I'm going to read the summary here just real briefly. Now, this episode did originally air on October 19th of 2020. And the summary basically states, this is coming from IMDb, that on an icy night, police find Joanne Romaine's abandoned car and assume she drowned in a nearby lake by suicide. But her family suspects foul play. So now, one of the things I talk about with each of these episodes is why we chose or decided to cover this particular episode here on the show. Now, my main interest in doing this particular episode for the show is because I just found it kind of oddly curious. There's a lot of questions about this particular episode, I felt like, and I just felt like this was worthy of discussion. And then also, too, just from a movie buff standpoint, this takes place in Grosse Pointe, and I keep thinking of the movie Grosse Pointe Blank. It's a stupid reason to want to talk about this particular episode. But I also found the setting to be oddly picturesque, too. Like when they show you the area in which this happened, it's kind of a really beautiful, kind of interesting place where this horrible, tragic thing occurred. So those are my particular reasons. So tell me, Eric, why were you interested in covering this particular episode for the Retro Rogues Live Mysteries?
Well, I think it's actually gotten a pretty decent amount of buzz out there in sort of the internet sphere, on the Reddits and things like that. A lot of people are very intrigued by this case, and I can understand why. I can definitely understand a lot of the questions that people are asking themselves about this case. But at the same time, I kind of also come at it from the other side, where it's almost like, in some ways, I feel like maybe a little bit of debunking has to be going on as well. So it's kind of like weighing both sides of that. On the one side, I think there is indeed a lot of compelling facts to this case, compelling inconsistencies and really crazy allegations as well. Like, we'll get into that as we talk about a little bit more, but there's a lot of crazy allegations in this case. But at the same time, I do think that in a lot of ways, Netflix kind of framed this particular episode. That they were definitely trying to tell a story, and I'm not sure if all the facts, were presented, in the proper context, because they were trying to present that story.
So this particular episode of Unsolved Mysteries, the way that they kind of set this up is it starts as a lot of these episodes often do. It kind of gives us sort of the dramatic hot take. So we kind of see the abandoned car. They show us this Catholic church where the car was apparently parked on one of the exit roads or whatever, going out to essentially, I could never determine if this was a highway. It looks like it's some kind of a major, road kind of coming and going. And then right beyond that is basically the water. Now, I'll be honest with you, it was weird geographically speaking, because I think they told us, but um the it's just strange because what they basically set up, or what they tell us, is that apparently Joanne, we just use her first name. Apparently, they're thinking that she just got out of her car, right? And then walks across these two roads, right? And then this crazy embankment of like all this different, like it's got a steep slope to it. There's like a weird little step off. There's these additional rocks, and then basically at that point you're in the water. And they're saying the water initially is actually relatively shallow. And that they're thinking that, and it was snowing, it was cold, there was, and they're saying that she will snow on the ground, not necessarily snowing. And then she basically just decides to end it and just goes walking off into the water. Hence the title of this particular episode, Lady in the Lake, although that kind of foreshadows where we're going to eventually end up. But that's how this kind of starts off with. They give us kind of the high pitch. And then they start off too by showing us one of the investigators. There's sort of like some old file footage, and this particular investigator is and this is one of the actual police officers. I think he's like a chief or something, and he's kind of sets up, and they're talking about, that he just thinks that basically she just walked off and essentially committed suicide, and he doesn't think there's much more to it. Kind of at times I felt like a little bit too cavalier, in my opinion, about it. Just sort of like, whatever. So tell me, Eric, this initial setup, I mean, it's obviously compelling and it's interesting, from a storytelling standpoint, because you want to know, well, how did we get there, right? So what did you think about some of these initial kind of series of events as they present them?
Well, it's kind of interesting, like going back to what you're talking about when they show the public safety director. They don't give you any context of where we're getting his statements from. They don't tell you. It's clear that it looks like, hey, this looks like, is this like archival footage? What is this? That it looks very, video-ish, low quality kind of video, and you're kind of sitting there scratching your head like, what is this? And of course, they don't ever tell you. Obviously, you kind of figure it out at the end, basically in the very last part of the episode. You know where all this footage is coming from, but nobody basically that's on the police side of this is directly interviewed by the folks from Unsolved Mysteries. Where they're getting this footage from is apparently some sort of deposition that was done for a civil litigation case. And, you don't find that out until like the very, very end of the episode. So it does kind of change things a little bit when you realize, well, wait a second. Maybe that's why he's talking the way that he's talking, is because he's talking for a civil deposition. He's not talking at a criminal trial. He's not talking even to like, the media in that kind of a context or anything like that. It's a very specific context that he's basically, this is like the disclosure period in a civil lawsuit case, which we don't get that information literally until the very, very end of the episode. One thing we do get right at the beginning, after they do that establishing shot of the church, was that we do get some archive footage of the daughter of, I believe it's Michelle, the oldest daughter. And she's pretty much the one that's on camera the most. And she's the one who actually kind of, for lack of a better term, she kind of controls the narrative throughout the entire program, the entire documentary. And one of the interesting things about the very beginning, I remember thinking this the first time I watched that. I've watched it since, and I wanted to see how do I feel watching it a second time. I still feel the same way. there's something really weird to me about when that news reporter is interviewing her in that archival footage. And I took some notes, and basically the news reporter says something to the extent of, um, "Who did your mom fear?" And the response of her daughter is, she sighs and she says, "That's a sensitive subject right now." And then the reporter follows up, "Well, could it be like family or somebody close to the family?" And her answer is, "I can't say that right now." And there was something about the way she was talking and her body language that just put me off for the whole rest of the program. And it happened the first time, and watching it the second time, the same thing happened. There's just something about her body language. And I started examining a little bit more the second time and thinking, okay, is it just maybe her personality? Is that what it is? Is that what I'm getting sort of a vibe off of, or something like that? It's just not jiving with me very well. Because there are people that are like that, where sometimes it's just a matter of their personality. It just doesn't quite click with you. You're not used to it. You don't like it, whatever it is. But it is something that, at least for me, biases me against her a little bit, because from the beginning I feel like I just don't really trust what she's saying.
Well, and that's kind of the thing, is that with the show, is it's hard to know how you feel about the various principal, people involved, because they set that up, and having just rewatched the episode, that's one of the things I found most curious, is that they kind of set up that there is some kind of foul play afoot, right? That there is something that's happened, and therefore she doesn't obviously believe it's suicide. She believes it's something else, maybe a murder, abduction, whatever. Because initially, and that's the other thing too, I have a hard time putting in context like when that footage was I think that technically is while she was still missing, right?
That's what I
um
believe as well. I believe that was taken while she was still missing at that time. Yeah.
right, so they haven't found the body yet. We're kind of jumping ahead, but they do eventually find, Joanne Remaine's body. But that happens much later in the episode. But initially, so when she kind of sets that up, I'm kind of thinking, oh, okay, well, like the other shows, we're going to set up, who the possible culprits are, right? But then we spend an inordinate lot amount of time just setting the same scenario over and over and up again, right? Like that, the one the one, I think he's like a chief or something. He's talking about how they show us these photos of the snow, and he's talking about how it looks like a hand and a butt impression, and then it looks like someone maybe kind of slipped or whatever, right? And then was working their way essentially to the water. Like that's kind of what they set up for us. And then we spend a lot of time, kind of, well, not a lot of time. We spent a lot of time at the beginning, kind of going over the specifics. The car was here. There's, obviously it looked like someone was making their way, out to the water. So they kind of set that up, and they kind of show us this information, and they show us like the footprints and whatever, and sort of how she goes out to the water. So, seeing that, it kind of, you could kind of see where someone might have been struggling to go out. But it's kind of weird, because when I see that, I don't I don't know. I mean, you have actually worked crime scenes, Eric, so you're going to know a lot more about this than I am. But when I initially saw these images of the snow, it didn't really tell me anything. It could tell me that someone was out there, you know what I mean? But in my mind, initially, my first thought is like, oh yeah, well, she was struggling to walk out there. Now later in the episode, when they show us how steep that embankment is, because they have one of the actual investigators that, I think Michelle or whoever actually hires, he has this lady. She puts on these shoes, and they actually walk down to show us how steep that embankment is, to give us a sense of, what they're saying actually happened. That this lady just got out of her car, and looking at this embankment and everything, I'm like thinking, well, I don't see how anyone could work their way down it. I assume that you would walk out there, you would slip, and then your butt would either just hit the concrete and you'd fall in the water. or you just go right into the water, but they do say it's shallow. And that's another thing too. I never really get in this story with this, as they set everything up, I never really get a sense, because they say that the water's very shallow, but they never spend a lot of time explaining to us like how shallow. Well, they do talk about how shallow the water is, but they never give us a sense for how far out it is that shallow, right?
Right.
Like we don't know if it's like a couple hundred feet. We don't know if it's 20 feet. We don't know if it's a mile. Like they never give us any sense for just how far this shallowness goes out into the water.
Although
Because
they do
eventually,
have archival footage that shows the rescue, or the attempted rescue operation, or search operation, I suppose, is what it was initially, and they do show the dive team, and they are running around on these little high-speed boats. So that it's at least deep enough that they're able to run around on those boats. You know what I mean? Because otherwise they wouldn't be able to. You wouldn't be able to use a motorboat if it's too shallow. So and obviously they had a dive team out there. So it wasn't. I think that's interesting because the whole thing about the depth, the only time I ever remember anybody specifically talking about that is actually the daughter, is Michelle. She talks about that it was 1 to 2 feet, and it's like nobody else ever really talks about that as far as what the actual depth was. They do have one of the divers. In fact, I think that's probably the only like official person that they have on this show that's actually was interviewed by Unsolved Mysteries. That's not some sort of archival footage or something from the deposition. And what he emphasizes is the thoroughness of the search and the fact that he is very confident that she was not there at that time. You know what I mean? That she was not in that part of the water at the time that they were conducting the search, because the search was so thorough. Um, but the thing is, they were riding around on speedboats. They obviously did have a full dive team. So I think that is actually a really relevant question: is how far is it, quote unquote, 1 or 2 feet or whatever it is, supposedly. Because you only have her word to say that. It would be a great thing for the diver guy to talk about, you know what I mean, as far as how deep this water is and how far out we're actually talking, because I'm sure at some point it obviously does get deeper. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had boats. You know what I mean? You're not going to be having boats in 2 feet of water. You know what I mean? It's not necessary, and you wouldn't be zooming around on high speed boats like that if there's 2 feet of water. So we're not talking about like the swamp type hydrofoils or something like that. These are just regular motorboats, rubber boats that they're running around on. So it is kind of interesting in that regard that you never really get someone official even talking about that, just to kind of clarify what was the actual conditions at that time, as far as the depths of the water and everything like that. Now, one of the interesting things, I have one of the pictures up, one of the crime scene photos up right now that does show kind of the footpath or whatever that they were initially attracted to. That's actually very relevant for the case, because that's apparently one of the big things in the civil litigation, which is not presented in the show, but it is relevant to the civil litigation that we can talk about later, after we kind of get through what they talked about on the show. But you can see, the picture that I have up right now, you can see kind of, as you mentioned, it's kind of really hard to know exactly what you're looking at, because it does just look kind of like a mess. But the thing is, the description goes along with it as far as what the officers were saying, what they saw. It does make a lot more sense, because what they're not just talking about shoe prints, they're talking about butt prints. They're talking about that this clearly was someone who was like either deliberately sitting down or was falling down. And it's kind of funny because that's not presented at all in the Netflix documentary. That's kind of the scenario that they're putting out there, is that yes, she was having trouble as she was walking around and fell on her butt multiple times. So it's not like she just walked out there without any problems. And one thing for me, when they did that sort of simulation, that investigator that did that simulation of a woman in high heels walking down the embankment, today, which is years later, and obviously there's no snow and everything like that. I felt that there was some staging with what he was doing, because he's like deliberately grabbing her. At no point does he like allow her to just walk on her own, because he's trying to emphasize, oh, it's not possible, And I'm thinking in my mind, well, let me find a stripper, you know what I mean, that can run in high heels, and let's try it with her without anybody, just objectively, and see if she can do it and how she does it. Someone that we know can walk really well in high heel shoes, which a lot of women can. That's just the way it is. Some women can do amazing things in high heels, and I use the extreme example of like a stripper. They can do practically anything with these huge high heel shoes on. And I just felt like there was some staging there because of the way that he was doing it, where, like I said, he's grabbing this lady, and we don't know anything about the lady that he's that's participating, because we don't know what her relationship is to him. This is not someone that I think he just got off the street and said, "Hey, do you walk really well in high heel shoes? Can you try this for me?" To me, it felt very staged. And I felt like he was really selling this idea that, oh, it's impossible to walk down this embankment. But the thing is, like, well, they're not really saying she walked down the embankment. It's like she fell in, you know what I mean? Like she wasn't like the official, police, account, their version of things is that they feel very strongly that this was deliberate. But the fact of the matter is, it could also be accidental. There's also that possibility. The family feels that that's just not possible because they feel like she was too cautious, that she wouldn't do that. But I actually have a scenario that I think is very, very possible in terms of how it could be an accident, even though there is sort of this element of suicidal thoughts, or maybe like what they call like suicidal ideation, where you're not quite to the point where you're going to kill yourself, but you're kind of thinking about it. That's one thing that I haven't heard presented on these Reddit forums or anywhere or anything like that. But it does make me think of, especially with the butt prints, because one interpretation of that is she's falling, but another one could be that she's sitting down and thinking. You know what I mean? She's just kind of thinking. Maybe she's taking in her life. Maybe she's just really kind of, thinking about all the bad things that have happened, because as we get more into this, the family had all sorts of crazy dynamics going on that very easily could have made her upset. And, maybe she's just walking along, she's thinking, and she is thinking, in terms of she's thinking about suicide. That doesn't mean she's going to commit suicide. That doesn't mean she wants to commit suicide. But maybe she's just like thinking, hey, maybe it would be better if I'm not around anymore. Maybe that would be easier. Maybe that would just be a way to stop all the pain and stop all the problems. And then the next thing you know, she just slips in. You know what I mean? Like she it really is an accident, but she was just kind of sitting there, like having those kind of thoughts without really wanting to do it, but just kind of just falls, and falls into the water. In the police scenario, they're basically saying it was deliberate, that she wanted to kill herself. That's what they think that's the scenario, that she deliberately went out there and killed herself. But the daughter brings up a great point, that she didn't have any kind of a note. She did live with her children and everything like that. The Catholic thing, I think, is kind of interesting because, I grew up Catholic, and, the thing about, like suicide with Catholics, that's actually changed quite a bit in the last, 30, 40 years. It used to be like, suicide was this huge taboo in the Catholic Church, but that's not true anymore. Like, it used to be like you couldn't, have like a Catholic, mass or whatever, you couldn't have a Catholic funeral because you commit suicide. That's not the case anymore. And I do, again, I guess that goes back to the fact that I just have some issues with the credibility of the daughter. She actually, she says, very, very forcefully, oh, my mom would never do it because she was a devout Catholic. She was really getting back into church. And I'm like, yeah, it's not really true, because that entire attitude towards suicide has changed within the Catholic Church.
Well, and And I can understand the logic behind that when they were talking about that on the show, that she would, because they do spend some time. It should be mentioned that they spend some time showing us some family photos. They talk about how important she was to the family, how much her daughters loved her, right, and her son. Um, what and it's important to emphasize that this is, an awful, unfortunate tragedy for the family, that she isn't in their lives anymore, as with most, family members when they're taken too soon. Um, you know, um, and they do spend a lot of time talking to some friends and some family members and talk about the fact that, in addition to the fact that she wouldn't have done that because of the consequences that her faith says that she couldn't move to the beyond, right? That in addition to that, they also, talk about the fact that, she seemed to be in a within. It's weird because they kind of set up that she was in a good place and she would never do that, but then they also kind of talk about the fact that apparently there was something going on, because they talk about when she's actually at her job. She's working at sort of like a boutique. I think they say that it's part-time, and that, there's something going on because I think it's her coworker or something mentions the fact that she goes out and she's taking these phone calls, and it kind of sets up that there's some sort of drama or something that's going on in her life. But it's weird because one of the things with this show is they don't spend a lot of time telling us what, at least I felt like, in my opinion, I don't feel like they spend a lot of time telling us what that potential drama could be.
Yeah.
Um,
What's interesting is there's actually a part in the episode where they actually do show some of the police report. And of course, they emphasize the specific parts to go along with the narrative that they're putting out. But what I did was I actually stopped it and I actually started reading as much as I could of what the report was. I actually wanted to get the actual police report for the program, but unfortunately, I contacted the Grosse Pointe police department. Well, actually, they call it the public safety department because they actually combine their police with fire, which is kind of interesting. So I actually contacted the records department, and what's interesting is if you're not involved in the case, like if you're not a victim or even a suspect or whatever, you're not directly involved with the case, you have to do a Freedom of Information Act request to get a copy of the report. And basically they say that they have, basically going to take at least like a week, possibly more. It might incur some fees as they try to find it, although I'm sure, I mean, they know exactly where this report is. I mean, the second you say the names, like, oh yeah, we know what that is. But it's not as streamlined as it is in a lot of other departments. Like I know in Arizona, it's for most departments, it's really pretty easy to get a report. You just call the records department. If you tell them some certain circumstances, like if you have a date, you have a name, that kind of stuff, that's enough. They'll be able to find the report number for you. You don't necessarily need the report number. And then it's like some sort of fee if you're not involved, and then they'll get the report to you, whichever format they use. It might be through email, they might mail it to you, they might give you the option, there might be different fees involved, but it's a pretty straightforward process. Whereas I guess this might be also just a Michigan thing. There you have to actually do a Freedom of Information Act request, which I think is interesting that they make you go through that kind of extra hurdle to get a copy of the report. But in the program itself, they actually do reference one of the police reports, and specifically, it has a lot to do with the daughter, with Michelle, in terms of her telling the officer, the investigating officer, the people that she thinks might have had something to do with her mother's disappearance, because she names names right away. She doesn't name names to that reporter, but she does name names fairly quickly to the police while this investigation is going on about who it is that she thinks might be involved. But one of the interesting things that I saw in that report was it does talk about the last time that she saw her mother, which they don't actually talk about in the episode, but it is referenced in that flash of the report where you can actually see when she last saw her, when she says she last saw her mother. And what's so interesting, and this is totally omitted other than the screenshot, where you can see the report on the screen. Apparently, she had been in court that day. So the entire family had been in court, including the estranged husband. And it says that she says the way she references it is she calls it like a civil matter or something like that. She's very vague. And to me, it seems very obvious there must have been something going on. Maybe the estranged husband and her, arguing over some sort of property. It doesn't say. It just says that they were in court with civil litigation, and it's like that's kind of relevant. So you're telling me the day of this woman's disappearance, she was in court with her ex, with her family. That we don't know what the context was of the actual trial or whatever it was. It's some sort of civil litigation. We don't know if it was related to like the divorce, if it was related to something with the kids, although they're not kids, they were all adults by this time. But you don't have any context other than you can look and see, well, apparently the husband was there and there was something that was going on. So the big question, that pops in my mind is, did it go well for her? Did it go badly for her? Did she get good news? Did she get bad news? If it was bad news for her, was it good news for the estranged husband, the divorced husband or whatever? None of that is even touched upon in this actual documentary, even though you can actually find it on screen, if you look quick enough, because, I just decided to freeze it and read as much of it as I could. And I just think that's amazing because she never even talks about the last time she saw her mother, which seems incredibly relevant once you realize the last time she saw her mother was in court, and you don't know what that court case was about.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like they allude to foul play, but they don't really spend any time, like I said, giving us anyone, or any set of circumstances that would either help bolster the argument of, suicide, an accident, the emotional distress. Like they don't give us anything in the show that really gives us any reason to think why she might be thinking about suicide in any context. And then secondly, they don't spend a lot of time giving us anyone to look at in terms of necessarily like, well, I think this person might have done it or that person. Now, part of that might be for legal reasons. And it's important to understand this is just a speculation show again. We're just theorizing. We don't know, but this is just for entertainment purposes. But I just thought it was unusual, that because most of the other, unsolved mystery shows, while the mystery is unsolved, they do give us some motivation, right? In some cases, the family members may say, "I think this person might have done it, that person might have done it," and so they kind of point us in some kind of a direction. But part of the reason I thought this episode might be worth discussing is the fact that literally there is no direction. They do kind of allude to the brother a little bit, which is kind of weird to me, but they don't really give us any circumstances that would make us think, oh, okay. Like, it's just sort of like, the police say it was suicide and they feel pretty firm that there wasn't an accident, it was just suicide. They don't give us any additional like other theories. The daughter seems to allude that it was foul play, especially in the initial setup, but they don't really give us anyone, right? Like they don't really.
The daughter does. I mean, the daughter accuses
but
everybody. The daughter accuses her father. She accuses her uncle of having something to do with it, although she doesn't think that he was directly involved in terms of like, she doesn't think he actually killed her. But the scenario that's played out with her brother is that he was heavily in debt at the time, and he admits that as well, that he was heavily in debt and he owed money not to the bank, he owed money to people. And that's just the way that he refers to it himself, as he owed money to people, which kind of implies that perhaps some of his loans were from nefarious characters. They don't say that, but he definitely implies that because that's what he says. He says, I owed a lot of money to people at the time. And he even says a really weird remark. One of the weird things that the brother says is he talks about how the scenario of, did someone kill his sister to intimidate him? because that's a scenario that's actually put out there by the daughter. It's not that her uncle did it; it's that her uncle knows something, and he did have some involvement because of they were trying to get to him and went through her. And what the brother actually says, and I found this like so kind of like, okay, yeah, maybe we need to look at this guy a little bit more. Is he said, I can't control that. If they basically said if they killed her for me, he literally said, I can't control that. And it was such a weird statement from, because they said like, oh, they were so close, this was like his mentor and this was like his life and everything like that. And he's like, well, they killed my sister to get to me. I can't do anything about that. That's the kind of tone that came out to me. It was so kind of chilling and such a weird thing to say. It's like, it's one of those things where you almost feel like this guy has some sort of, like a real, what's the term I'm looking for? Like a cognitive dissonance kind of thing where it's like, he doesn't quite want to, he understands that he is responsible, doesn't want to take responsibility for the fact that he knows something happened. Also, he's the one that presents this crazy idea that comes out of nowhere because they have all these investigators talking about different scenarios. The daughter plays out her scenario, which she basically thinks her mother was abducted, taken to a different location, dumped, and then they brought the car back. That's essentially what she thinks. And that's kind of one of the investigators kind of goes along with that idea. There's multiple investigators also. I think that's important to point out is that she did a lot of she went to a lot of different people, I think, trying to get the answer that she wanted. That's the way that I take it. Is that she, I was talking to you off the air, like we used to call it like cop shopping. Like she keeps going to all these different people until she gets the answer that she wants, whether that's the real answer or not, she's going to get the answer that she wants. And it's kind of funny because the brother presents this scenario where he says, well, I don't think they intended to kill her. I think they were just trying to scare her and they killed her on accident. I'm like, where the hell would you get that from? From any of the stuff that's been discussed, any of the investigation, including the private investigators? Like nobody has any evidence of that. Where the hell is he coming up with that scenario from, But again, it alludes to that kind of chilling remark. Well, I can't control what happens. If they're going to go after her because of me, even though this is my beloved sister, I can't control that. That line just really resonates in my head. And it did again. It did the first time and it does again. His sort of cavalier attitude towards that, to what he's saying, like, I want justice for my sister and blah, blah, blah. It's like, dude, if you're responsible in any way for the death of your sister that you supposedly love so much, you should be torn to pieces. You should be like, it's my fault, right? If you have any guilt, if you have any conscience, be like, it's my fault. Even though I didn't kill her, it's my fault. You know what I mean? I'm the one who got her into this. They were trying to get to me. You never see any of that from him. Instead, you see this sort of crazy attitude where he thinks, and he gets it from like nowhere, it seems like, he thinks somebody was trying to scare her and accidentally killed her. And there's nothing on either side of the investigation, whether it's the family or the police, there's nothing to indicate that it was some sort of just, accident, that they accidentally killed this woman. Like nobody's presenting that scenario except for him. He's the only one that actually says something like that. And to me, it just seems like it's just crazy, unless the man knows something, right? Unless the man actually does know something and actually did get something later on that indicated to him, yes, this was a message, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? It's just a really, really odd thing to say. And then, of course, the third scenario, or the third suspect that they present, is the cousin Tim, who was actually a police officer in another jurisdiction, very close to where this all happened at. So he was not a police officer of the specific department that investigated this, where this, jurisdiction where it occurred, but he was basically, my understanding was he was a deputy for the county that was like right there adjacent to this particular particular town, And there's some interesting stuff that I got from outside of the series, from some of the court documents that I was able to scrounge up, that gets into that a little bit more about what he was actually doing that night, and everything like that. And it's kind of interesting too. One of the investigators that the family got involved was actually a former FBI agent, and to me, I think he sounds like the most credible of all the investigators that I saw in that program. To me, he was the one that was most credible. And he actually, it's interesting, he does not absolve the brother. In other words, he says, I really don't know if the brother had anything involved with this. But when he talks about the dad, he says, I looked into the dad and I'm pretty much confident he had nothing to do with it. When he talks about Tim, the cousin, he says, I talked to him, I'm pretty confident he had nothing to do with it. But he leaves it open about the brother having something involved with it, and basically says, yeah, that one I don't know about. That one I'm not sure.
Well, and I think that's interesting too as we move forward. So basically, so she goes missing. Okay, we've established that. We've established that she was a good mother, that the family members are obviously distraught that she's missing. We've seen some old news footage, we've seen some various things, we've seen some stuff apparently from like a deposition or whatever, just random different things. And then as they move the story forward, basically we find out that 70 days later, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's 70 days later, that they get some additional information, and basically they find her body, um, and it is quite a distance away from where they're thinking that she fell into the water. And see, this is the part, because this is what I'm talking about. This episode to me, when I talk, is here's the thing: they outline some different people that they think might have been involved, quote unquote, in the foul play angle, right? But I never felt like I never got much of a motivation for why. That was one of the notes that I wrote down. It's like, well, why? Why are these people like? I could understand, that maybe the ex had something to do with it. Usually in like domestic, things get crazy, right? But they don't spend a lot of time talking about the ex necessarily. They don't spend hardly any
Or the
time
fact
talking
that
about.
they were actually in court that day.
Yeah, they don't bring any of that up. So that was the big thing. And based on what you were saying about, some of the investigators and stuff, they pretty much rule him out anyway. But the thing that I kept coming back to is, well, why? So as I'm questioning this, because like I said, I don't feel like the show does a very good job of explaining some of this, at least to me anyway. We with my dull brain, whatever, I didn't really get any real sense, because that was the thing I kept questioning. It's like, well, why? Well, anyhow, so she's missing, and then eventually they do find her body. She has died, and she's basically drifted like down this river, right, like past Detroit, right? It's like outside of Detroit, and it's a small island that apparently at some point was some kind of like an amusement park of some kind that people are kind of familiar with. And then they kind of take us out on a boat, and they're kind of taking us out there. And that's where I'm like going, well, wait a minute. Earlier in the show, the daughter was talking about that the water was super shallow, right? And I'm like, well, how in the world did she get down? And that's when we get this first theory, or at least in my mind, one of these early theories, where someone abducted her, took her basically out to Detroit, dumped her body. It flowed downriver and eventually winds up on this island. So that's sort of, but then again, like I said, for me, they don't really give us enough information about the depth of the water and what's happening with the water, on the other side of these roadways by this Catholic church, for me for me in my mind to immediately rule out the fact, well, what if she just accidentally slipped into the water, went downstream, whatever, and then wound up here, right? Like that, to me, that seems to be logical. Whether there was like an argument and an accidental thing or whatever, right? Because there may have been someone there arguing with her, right? We don't know. But regardless, it seems to me, because they don't explain the whole situation with how deep this water is, it's perfectly logical that she could have just accidentally slipped and fell in, maybe hit her head or something, or what. Well, they don't say she's got any blunt force trauma, but she would have just slipped into the water, and eventually, went basically downstream and it wound up at this island. This all could just be an accident. So, but it's so weird that they try to give us a scenario where at least someone wants to give us the scenario where basically it isn't an accident. But to me, it seems perfectly logical that she could have just slipped and fell in. So, how did you feel about this, these series of events? I mean, does it seem logical to you too that she could, well, you brought forth this idea too. Do you think it's logical that she could have just slipped and fell in?
Yes. Yeah. I don't think it's necessarily like a straightforward kind of a thing where, she was just decided just randomly to go out there and, slipped and fell in. Like this, the scenario that I'm kind of putting forth is a little bit different from that. It almost kind of, it's almost kind of like a halfway point, if you will, where you're kind of saying, from my perspective, is that maybe she was just kind of in that contemplative mood, kind of depressed and upset. And I know the family said multiple times she was not depressed or she was not upset, that she was upbeat. A lot of people are very good at hiding that kind of stuff, especially mothers. Actually, mothers are really good at hiding that stuff. And so a lot of people, what they do is they hit themselves inside. You know what I mean? They don't project. They really tear themselves up inside. And so a lot of people, they talk about sort of like that ticking time bomb or that kind of a situation. And that's kind of one of the things that I was thinking was like a possible scenario for basically what amounts to an accidental death, because I don't think it was necessarily like, I don't think necessarily that it was like she had planned it, like she had planned to go ahead and kill herself, because there's no indication of that. There's no indication of the planning side of it. Like, they make some kind of interesting points that are kind of, you think at one point, maybe they're relevant, maybe they're not. Like one of the investigators, I remember he was making a big deal of the fact that, well, why would she gas up her car and then kill herself? Well, that's not what she did. She gassed up her car and then she went to church. You know what I mean? So she actually did have like somewhere else where she went. It wasn't like she just gassed up the car and then she just drove off the side of the road. You know what I mean? That's not what happened. That's not the scenario. That's not the time frame. It's very well documented that basically she dropped her son off. And by the way, I thought it was interesting that the son was the last family member to see her, and he's not involved in the program at all. The sister does say he's very upset. It's hard for him to talk about it, but I just found that interesting that this is the last family member that saw her alive, and we never hear an interview from him. We only see him in archival footage. But the scenario is that basically she had dropped off her son and apparently had said, one thing that I found striking was, according to the family, she had said, "I'll be right back." And they never go back to that. Okay, wait a second. So she said she'll be right back from getting some gas. And that's what she said she was going to do. I'm going to go get some gas. But then she goes and get gas, and then she decides to go to the church. And it's very inconsistent the way that the daughter is telling the story, because she's like, one minute she just said, she told my brother, "I'll be right back. I'm just going to go get some gas. I'm just going to fill up the car." Makes perfect sense. At the end of the day, you fill up the car for the next day's activities, right? But then after she fills up the gas tank, she goes to church. And that wasn't what at least the daughter presented as something she had said to her son, who she just dropped off at home. She said she'd be right back. So that gets you into the mindset, at least for me, that she was starting to have some sort of thoughts. Maybe she was upset. Church is obviously a place where people go for comfort. You know what I mean? So it's like she knew that they had daily mass, or they had mass that day. And she was just like, I'm going to go to church. I'm not feeling so good. Again, maybe something bad happened in that trial. Maybe things were not going so well for her. Maybe she was looking at losing a lot of money. I can only speculate because I don't know anything about that, because I don't present it in the actual documentary. But maybe she's a little upset. There are tons of other things going on in her life at this point, especially with her brother. We didn't really even touch about the fact that ever since her mother had died, there had been this big family feud between, it was basically her and her brother against the other brother and the other sister. And it split the family down the middle. And then there were the cousins getting involved. That's kind of how the cousin becomes part of the scenario, because the cousin apparently was friends with the other brother, the brother that she was feuding with. And they don't tell you this, but this is stuff that I found through the court documents that I looked at and things and other sources I looked at. They were actually one of the things they were fighting over was this wine business. So they had this wholesale wine business, and apparently the older brother, the sort of estranged brother, he had taken over the business. He was supported by the other sister. Meanwhile, the other side was our victim and John, the sort of the bad brother, the black sheep brother that was having the financial problems. And they were sort of paired up against each other, feuding over this business and over a fortune of $20 million that had been left by the mother to be split 5 ways. I don't know who the fifth person was, because my understanding was there were 4 siblings, but maybe there was another one that is kind of fallen through the cracks with this. But it was supposed to be split 5 ways. They did mention that in the documentary, that there was this family fortune that they've been feuding over because they did not feel that it had been properly, that it had been properly parceled out. So there's all these. My point is, there's all these different things going on in this woman's life. This woman's life was not perfect. She had complained to numerous people that she thought she was being followed. She thought that people were messing with her mail. She was having all sorts of. She was accusing her husband of being behind it. She was accusing her cousin Tim of being behind it, who was again a police officer. She was having all these different things, and that could be interpreted as possibly paranoid delusions, right? But at the same time, there's also the other side of that, which is just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get me, because that happens too, right? Just because she might have been off. She might have been like, maybe somebody really was like stalking her or messing with her. Maybe it could even be a random person that wasn't connected to any of this stuff, That's a possibility too. That's not even presented, in this documentary as could she have been the object of a stalker or something else where she had misinterpreted what's going on. But getting back to what I was saying, there's all this stuff going on for her. So I could see her, she goes to church. She wants to get some comfort there. She's kind of in a contemplative mood. She's kind of like thinking about things. One of the big things that they make a big point about the family side is that they say they have a witness who came out, like was one of the last people to come out of the church. And she remembers looking specifically like both ways in that parking area. And she didn't see the car. She didn't see the car of the victim. And so from that one witness, they're like, okay, so the car left and then it came back. Now, one issue, of course, is even the investigator says that the witness said it was very, very, very dark. So there's always that real obvious possibility that the car was there. That person just didn't see it. You know what I mean? That's one of the first obvious things. But the other side of that is, with the kind of the scenario that I'm playing out a little bit, she's in that contemplative mood and she gets in the car and she drives around the block or she drives around town a little bit because she's thinking. How many of us have done that? You know what I mean? You drive around because you're in that mood. You're thinking about stuff. You're processing stuff. You're having a lot of problems. And you're driving around. And what do? You end up driving in a circle. You come right back to the place that you started. And then you get out and you decide, hey, you know what? I need some air. I need to think. That kind of scenario. And, that's something that they don't even really touch on, because it doesn't necessarily have to be nefarious at that point. It's just somebody is in that mood. They're introspective. They're thinking about things, and they start to just kind of walk around. The big issue that they talked about was, they felt that she was too cautious to walk over the traffic. But if you're in that mindset, and you're just not really thinking, or you just kind of don't care at that point, you can do something like that. If you had a really bad day and you're kind of at your breaking point, that last straw that's going to break the camel's back, you might do something like that. You definitely could do something out of character. That's not out of the realm of possibility. And then I did want to mention one thing I also found interesting was that one of the investigators who I had some problems with, he was the one who was kind of pushing this scenario of she was abducted in the parking lot. and taken to a different location. And he specifically said she was either killed or rendered unconscious and then thrown in the water. There's absolutely zero evidence of that. There's zero evidence of anything from the 3 autopsies. There were 3 autopsies done, and one of the legal documents I found references all 3 of them. One was done by the Canadian authorities because her body was found in Canada. And how much more objective can you get than that? That this is a foreign country, and they did an autopsy with her before they released the body. Then the locals did it, the local jurisdiction that she lived in, she did it. Then the family went out and got someone from one of the universities to do an independent. 3 autopsies, okay? 3 autopsies. None of them showed anything that would indicate that she was, killed somehow before she went in the water. You know what I mean? There wasn't even evidence of the scenario of like, because I thought about this, because one of the issues was, I don't know if they present the documentary, but it's in the information that I found. One of the issues was she apparently didn't have water in her lungs, which is a really very odd thing to happen when somebody drowns, for them not to have water in their lungs. But the thing is, I was thinking in that scenario, well, maybe she kind of fell, hit her head, you know what I mean? So then basically she was either unconscious or dead already and then fell in the water, right? The problem is the autopsy doesn't show any indication of blunt force trauma to the head or anything like that. The only thing they have is she had some bruises on her left arm. And the daughter really hinges on that because she feels that's indication of a struggle, because in addition to that, her purse was ripped. And it's like, okay, you're really stretching things there. You know what I mean? You're really stretching things there, because it's like, there's no indication that she was that she was dead before she hit the water. You know what I mean? That's what I'm trying to say. It's really a strange thing. I mean, 3 autopsies and none of them indicate anything about any kind of blunt force trauma or anything, any kind of toxicology. I don't know how much of a toxicology they could do, because she was having some, there was some deterioration of the body. But there's nothing in any of those reports and the information that I found that says that any of that occurred. So it's kind of like, if you're going to say that they rendered her unconscious and then threw her in the water, or they killed her and threw her in the water, well, how did they do it? You know what I mean? How did they kill her? How did they render her unconscious? And basically all three of those autopsies all concluded that she drowned. Now they can't say how she drowned. Like they can't say, was it deliberate or not? Like, was she pushed under the water? You know what I mean? That kind of a thing. But all 3 of those autopsies said that she drowned. And that's the Canadians, the locals, and an independent private.
Well, and I'm honestly of the opinion, and I've kind of put this forward already. I just think that, like you said, just to kind of go kind of put out there just my theory. I do feel like, based off what we've discussed, and again, this is just my opinion. We're just speculating for fun, but based on what we've discussed, what I saw in the show, I really honestly have the opinion that she was, kind of like you're putting forth. She was just in sort of that sort of mood. She was questioning things. She was thinking about things. It's obvious she had an awful lot going on in her life, right? And that she was maybe contemplating something or thinking about something, and then it was an accident. She fell, into the water. They don't tell us how cold the water was. I mean, there's snow on the ground. It's obviously got to be cold. And she basically just washed down river, and during the course of this, basically she passed, right? And then they discovered her body much later, and it's far enough away that it would make sense that, unless they're doing an extensive search, I don't think they initially would have found her body, because of how far away her body wound up. So
Right.
to me, that kind of just sort of makes sense in my mind anyway. And again, it's just my opinion. I don't know anything, but that's what I have a feeling actually happened. I don't feel like it's that much of a mystery, other than we can't definitively prove this happened or definitively prove that happened. I just think, kind of like because on our other show, we talked about the case of the West Point grad who they found in
The
the
Washington
dump.
Insider.
Yeah, we talked about that one, and I had put forth and thought that, based on personal experiences I've had over the last few years with family members who've had issues with mental illness, that to me it doesn't seem impossible, like in his case, that he just had a psychotic break, maybe his briefcase was stolen, and that all these other events unfortunately led to his death, right? And where they eventually discovered him, even though it seems implausible, it's totally logical that could have been the series of events that unfolded. And I think that's the case here. I don't necessarily believe that there was foul play. I do believe that she probably was worried about things. She probably was scared. We don't know exactly what happened in this civil case, right? That was ongoing. She had a lot going on. She, obviously she went to church, so she might have been seeking, some kind of divine intervention or some revelation that would help her to find the strength for whatever reason. And then she just was sitting out there, got out of her car and walked over, and was maybe thinking about things, and I think she just accidentally slipped and fell. I mean, I honestly believe that's what happened. That's my theory. And I think you are in a similar place, right, Eric?
Yeah, that's kind of what I lean towards, is that scenario. But there is also the element of some of those kind of strange unanswered questions. It is documented. Part of one of those reports that they showed, they did say that there was a report that she had gone to an attorney's office, and she was complaining about the fact that she felt that her husband was involved in basically interfering with her mail somehow, like stealing her mail, that she felt that she was being followed. What's interesting about that also is that's not presented in the actual documentary, except in looking at that little snippet of the police report. Because I would like to have known, like, well, did they talk to somebody at the law office to get specifically what it was she was concerned about? And also, what was their response? Did they take her seriously? Did they dismiss her? You know what I mean? Because that can also speak to her sort of her mental state. If she thinks all this stuff is happening to her, and she's reaching out to people, and people are telling her, "Oh, you're just nuts," you know what I mean, or "You're crazy," or whatever they're saying, that can make you crazy. You know what I mean? That can actually like fuel that fire, because you're sitting there like you're trying to reach out, you're trying to get some help, and nobody's listening to you. Nobody's taking you seriously. And what that does is that can make you spiral, and that goes back to that straw that breaks the camel's back. You can be a perfectly healthy, normal, well-adjusted person, but all these bad things start happening to you all of a sudden, and they happen within a short period of time, and you're convinced that somebody's out to get you. It can make you do crazy things, even though you're not a crazy person. Because I think that's what people don't get sometimes. It's like, oh, well, she had no history of depression, she had no history of mental illness. Well, sometimes it builds up, it builds up underneath, and people just they start to lose their ability to cope, and so I think that there's definitely a possibility that's, I think a very strong possibility that that's what happened. Like, it was actually kind of almost like halfway. It's like this sort of crazy accident that was sort of induced by this maybe introspection, combined with a little bit of depression that was simmering underneath all this pressure, all this stress that was going on. And she simply slipped, you know what I mean? Like, again, the butt prints, you know what I mean? That's something to really think about too, because it's like on the one side, you can think, well, she's just kind of slipping and falling as she's going in. But the other side of that could be she was just sitting there. She's sitting down, and she's thinking about things, and she's trying to get a better view of the water. Maybe the water was somehow soothing to her or something like that. There's all sorts of scenarios. You don't know what's going on in a person's mind at that time. But I will acknowledge the fact that there's always that possibility that, as I said before, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get me, that because that can happen as well. And the one thing I will also put out there, and I touched on it, was the random act of violence possibility too, which is that all these problems she was having with all these different people, and it could just be that no, she just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and somebody just went ahead and pushed her in, you know what I mean? Or crime of opportunity, that kind of a thing. Or that somebody indeed was screwing with her, and it was none of the actual suspects. It was none of these people she was having real problems with. It wasn't the husband. It wasn't had anything to do with her brother. It wasn't anything to do with the cousin. It was somebody else, that was just kind of like maybe stalking her or something like that, and decided that, maybe confronted her in that moment to say, hey, who knows how a stalker thinks, goes over there and saying, oh, this is my opportunity. I'm going to reach out to her, and she doesn't react well. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's interesting because there are definitely a lot of unanswered questions. And again, I think Netflix kind of framed things in a way where they withheld a lot of very relevant information. The most relevant thing, for me is, man, it is not cool to have the ending title card tell us that there was civil litigation going on. And they don't tell us this was $100 million case. The family was suing the city and the police department for $100 million. Okay. So that's some serious money. And this family was having all sorts of problems over money. And, I've seen that scenario many times, unfortunately, where a family tears themselves apart over scraps, literally over scraps. And we're talking 20 million with the grandmother, $100 million with the city. I mean, we're talking huge numbers. And this is an affluent community. You know what I mean? That's also important to remember. That's never even discussed. Was she in debt? Where she have, because they said all she did was like work part-time at a boutique. So I think she was, it implies she was living off of that inheritance, from the, even though she said they were saying she was cheated, she's living in this very affluent area. You know what I mean? And obviously she had some money, and she was just working part-time at a clothing store, So who was paying those bills, And she was in the house with the kids. So there's a lot of unanswered questions here about that I wish, that the Netflix documentary had gotten into, because I think they're really relevant. All this whole civil litigation thing, the whole conflict with her parents, I mean, her family in general, those things are pretty relevant, and they really didn't give us the full story. I mean, Jay, you obviously, you realized just when I told you, right, that she had been in court that day. I mean, don't you think that's irrelevant? Don't you think that's kind of important? The fact that she had been in court, and we don't know why, we don't know how it went. You know what I mean? It's like,
Well, yeah, and that's kind of what I was talking about by, I jotted down the note of why, because that's what I feel like. There's obviously, you can tell that there's kind of some missing pieces here. And while they put forth all these different random theories, they don't really do, in my mind anyway, a very good job of kind of narrowing it down, you know what I mean, to give us, in terms of storytelling purposes anyway, some, in my mind anyway, they set some things up, but in my mind, they don't do a very good job of, kind of quote unquote, pointing us in a particular direction beyond the fact that they believe it was foul play.
yeah,
Right. It feels like they very much want us to believe it's foul play, but in my mind, they don't give us enough information, in my mind anyway, to make me go, oh, okay, yeah, I could see that. Because to me, the more I look at everything and the more that I look at this, I mean, she was, obviously, I honestly believe it was an accident. She was probably out there thinking about something. She was concerned about something. She had a lot going on, right? We don't know exactly what had transpired in regards to this case, right? Because she was in court. We don't even know really honestly exactly what that was all about. And there's a lot of information about the family that they don't really fill us in. That's the thing. It feels like an incomplete picture, but it's foul play. It's like, well, wait a minute. You're not giving me enough information to just immediately go along with your theory that it's foul play, because there's other episodes of Unsolved Mysteries. It's very clear. They kind of give you these series of events and you go, oh, okay. And then you have that kind of, I think it was, whatever. But in this one, I didn't feel that way. I felt like, well, I feel like I'm missing some information here, and I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced it was foul play. I honestly think that it was maybe an accident. I don't think it was intentional suicide either. I mean, she might have been in that mental state, but I think that, I'm honestly of the opinion she just accidentally slipped and fell. Now she was at the river's edge, you know what I mean? So maybe she was contemplating things, right? But I don't necessarily believe that it was foul play. Again, it's just my opinion. I'm not a legal expert. I'm not a former investor. None of that. And again, this is just for entertainment purposes. We're just speculating. But based off what I'm seeing and the conversation we have before the show, we started recording the show this evening. I'm honestly of the opinion that this was just an accident. She was at the river's edge, yes, but I have the feeling that she might have just accidentally slipped and fell. So, and that's why it's not more obviously suicide, is while she may have been having suicidal thoughts, I don't think she intended to do anything that night. She was just, and yes, ever good to admit these kind of things, but I found years ago, found myself in a place like that where you're just thinking, well, the world would just be better off without me. And you're having all these crazy thoughts, and you're thinking about doing something, but you don't actually, metaphorically speaking, you don't actually pull that trigger, right?
Right.
Because everyone goes through tough times, right? Hopefully there's someone there to pull you back from the edge, right? But I think in her case, there wasn't anyone there to pull her back from the edge. Maybe she did decide, well, I'm not going to, but then accidentally she just slipped and fell,
Right. Yeah. No, I can totally relate to that scenario. I think it's something that it is a lot more likely than what they're coming up with, because there's so much missing from the scenarios that they're trying to put together. And again, I just looked at those 3 autopsies. I wasn't able to get the actual reports, but in one of the civil litigation documents that I found, they referenced the 3 autopsies. And it's, I mean, how much more can you get than that? You get 2 different governments from 2 different countries, and then independent, and they all say she drowned. So it's like, I don't know, the scenario of being unconscious or dead prior to going into the water. It's like, well, where do you get that from? The evidence just isn't there. There's just nothing there to say that that's what happened.
Interesting. Do you have anything else you want to add, or do we think that's pretty good?
No, just like I do emphasize again that I think that Netflix kind of fooled us a little bit. I wish they would give us a little bit more information about that civil litigation. It was a big case. It was a big deal. Like I said, it was a big number. And that's relevant. That's relevant as far as the motivation of the family and why they're doing this. And I don't want to question them. I don't know them or anything like that. But, if you're going to put yourself out in the public sphere like that, well, then you have to be questioned, and you have to put that information out there. If you tell me that information from the get-go and say, hey, this is the deal, that to me puts you in a better light, then I can understand, even though this is something that might be considered questionable, hey, you're putting the skeletons, out from the closet right away. But when I find it out at the end, after you presented all these crazy scenarios and stuff like that, then I feel like you're hiding something from me.
I want to thank you for watching this episode of the Retro Rogues Live Mysteries. This is kind of our first episode in this new series that we're going to be doing. We're not always going to be talking about episodes of Unsolved Mysteries necessarily, but these are just things that we find interesting that are a mystery that we think is worthy of discussion or further examination. So I want to thank you for watching this episode. I want to thank my co-host, Mr. Eric Alexander, for bringing forth his unique perspective and experiences. So tell us, Eric, where can people hopefully learn or find out more about you on the interwebs?
Well, I'm most active on Twitter, and that is at BassGod14. That's at BASSGOD14. And that's also my DMs are always open. So if you do have some show suggestions, you can always reach me that way and let me know what it is you're thinking about. Um, we don't want it to all be unsolved mysteries, but I do love the classic unsolved mysteries. And so one of the things that I've been talking with Dave about is possibly going back to some of those old unsolved mysteries that are still unsolved. I think that would be kind of fun. But if you have other ideas, we've talked about getting stuff from, the old Coast to Coast radio show. We've talked about, Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of, some of the stuff they talked about, this, even if it's like the supernatural, the occult, alien conspiracies. Oh, conspiracies. Hey, there's actually one brewing right now, right before our eyes. Maybe we'll go there. You never know. So
Start over again. So I'm already flubbing this all over the place. This should be easier.
That's funny. When we're live, you never do
Yeah,
this.
I know. It's different. It's different when you do it like this. Okay, all right. So
but that's
try
just
again.
funny because
All right.
when we're live, you never do this.
Yeah.